So I've been watching a lot of fight scenes recently, and it's gotten me thinking. Movie and animations can obviously do a fight scene a lot of justice, but what about in writing? I don't have any fight scenes in books that stands out to me. So I wanted to challenge myself to write one that's interesting. So without further ado, here's what I got. The bonds of ash and ether. Kale stood at the base of the crumbling temple, his chest heaving as he gazed up at the towering figure of Alara. She stood on higher ground, her silver hair glowing faintly in the ethereal light that poured through the shattered ceiling. The heart of ether pulsed faintly in Kale's hand, its crystalline surface cooled against his heated grip. The heart did not budge under Kale's determined grip. Alara looked down at him, her expression a mix of sorrow and resolve. "You don't have to do this, Kale," she said, her voice tinged with the faintest quiver. "There's still time to end this without bloodshed." Kale's eyes hardened, his jaw tightening. "You already chose blood when you decided to take the heart and hid it," he said. Ash swirled around him, the power of the god of ashes and passion stirring within him like a wildfire threatening to burst free. "If you won't stop this war, I will." Alara's shoulders stiffened, her sorrow giving way to a grim determination. "So be it." Alara struck first. From her elevated position, she swept her hands, glowing like moonlight, in a wide arc, and the air around Kale shimmered as gravity itself shifted. She looked down at Kale as she coerced the mana in the earth. The ground beneath Kale buckled, forcing him to dive to the side as chunks of stone ripped free and hurled towards him. He rolled to his feet, flames already licking at his hands. "You have grown stronger," Alara said, her voice heavy with a strange mix of pride and regret. "But strength alone isn't enough." Kale forced mana into his hands, making it glow like a sun. He thrusted his hands forward, a torrent of molten ash surged towards her like a tidal wave. Alara raised a hand, summoning a translucent barrier of ether that absorbed the searing heat. The barrier shimmered as cracks began to form, and Alara's eyes flickered with surprise. "You taught me that," Kale said, his voice raw, "and I've had a lot of time to learn." The god of ashes and passion stirred within Kale, its voice a deep rumble in his mind. "Shape the field, Kale. Make it yours. Let the instability remind her what she's lost." Kale's finger moved instinctively, dragging molten ashes out from the ground to form jagged obsidian spires. He grimaced as he hurled some towards Alara, forcing her to retreat as sharp shards splintered against her shield. Others he planted into the ground, creating an unstable, treacherous battlefield. Each step now carried the risk of injury, the sharp edges mirroring the fractured trust between them. Alara's attack grew sharper, more desperate. She slammed her hands down and the air around Kale compressed, dragging him to his knees. The atmosphere around him grew heavy. "Why are you so stubborn?" she shouted, her voice breaking. "Do you think this is what I wanted for you? For us?" Kale roared in defiance, slamming his fist into the ground. Flames erupted around him, disrupting Alara's hold and sending a turbulent wave of heat crashing towards her. She leapt to higher ground, her movement less fluid than before. Her shoulders heaved with exertion, and Kale noticed for the first time how the years have caught up with her. Lines creased her face, and her once imposing frame seemed leaner, less commanding. In contrast, Kale has gotten stronger. His muscle rippled beneath his scorched tunic, his time away evident in the power and precision behind every strike. As he closed the distance between them, Alara's gaze flickered, a brief shadow of doubt crossing her face. Kale briefly thought of all the time that Alara had given him proud, approving looks, and now she would no longer give him the same look. Alara concentrated her gravity onto Kale's chest and squeezed the air out of him. Kale knelt down as he clutched his chest, coughing, as the life drained from his body. As Kale turned pale, Alara, in a moment of weakness, stopped her magic to talk to Kale. But the instant she stopped, Kale threw a vortex of ashes at her, lifting her up in the air. Alara struggled as the molten ashes clogged her nose and mouth. She struggled to breathe. Sputtering, she mustered the strength to use her magic, to drag him into his own vortex of molten ashes. Gritting his teeth in pain as the molten ashes pelted him, he released the spell. A single moment of peace passed as they both stood there, within striking distance of each other's magic, wondering who would attack first. When they finally clashed in close combat, the difference was undeniable. Kale's strength forced Alara to step back, her graceful movement faltering under his relentless assault. But even as he struggled, her attack remained precise. Every strike aimed to exploit a weakness. A kick to the knee to slow his advances, a redirection of his arm to limit his magic's range. Alara rushed through all her tricks to keep up with Kale. "You've changed," she said, parrying an obsidian blade Kale had effortlessly forged mid-strike. "But you're still that boy who doesn't understand what's at stake." "And you're still the mentor who thinks she knows better," Kale retorted, his voice laced with bitterness. He swung the blade again, forcing Alara back into the unstable ground. The obsidian spire shifted beneath her feet. Slicing into her boot, she winced but refused to fall. The god of ashes and passion surged again, his voice booming in Kale's mind. "Push her. Show her the truth of what she's become." Kale focused his energy into the spire, causing them to erupt into fiery shards. The battlefield became a storm of jagged rocks and molten heat, forcing both combatants to adapt. Alara leapt between crumbling platform with the grace of a fairy, her ether magic forming temporary footholds in midair. Her face, once resolute, now showed cracks of uncertainty. As she saw Kale's determination, his anger and resolution made her flinch for a brief moment. "You can't win like this," she yelled, deflecting a barrage of flaming shards. "You'll destroy us both." "Maybe that's the price we have to pay," Kale said, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. The ground around them crumbled, or growled and burst with molten ashes. The space around them was quickly becoming an orchestra of destruction and chaos. Their next clash was brutal, raw emotions bleeding into every strike. Alara's met each knife slash with a quick kick, and each fiery blast with a shield of ether. However, Alara hesitated for the briefest moment, her eyes searching Kale's face as if hoping to find the student she once knew, the baby boy she once held to sleep. In that hesitation, Kale's obsidian blade connected, shattering her shield and forcing her to stumble. Kale stood over her, the heart of ether still clutched in his hand. Alara looked up at him, her breathing labored. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice soft. "There's still another way." Kale's grip tightened on the heart. "This is the only way," he said. "The god of ether and impulse has to go." The god of ashes and passion roared in approval as Kale unleashed his final attack. He took the obsidian knife, now filled with Alara's ether magic, and poured his hardened flames over it. It fused into an iridescent flame surrounding the blade. In one smooth strike, he stabbed the heart with the prismatic flamed knife. Flames consumed the heart, shattering it into 1,000 fragments that dissolved into the air. The explosion knocked them both back, the temple collapsing around them. Scorch marks fanned out around them. Kale lay on the ground, his body battered and singed, but alive. Alara rose slowly, her eyes filled with something he couldn't quite place. Sorrow, pride, and resignation all at once. "No, you've destroyed everything," she said quietly. Kale forced a weak smile. "No, I saved it." For a long moment, neither spoke. The world stopped and the background sounds all faded. Then Alara turned and walked away, her figure disappearing into the smoke and ashes. Then the world continued with its orchestra of destruction and chaos. Nothing around Kale seemed to change. There was nothing and no one around him anymore to give him any approving looks. There was just him, and the choices he made as he lay on his bed of chaos. Above them, the gods watched in silence, their war forever changed by the choices of two mortals who had dared to defy them.